The morning sun was just breaking through the London clouds when Colonel Harrison stepped out of his black military car. He could smell the fresh air mixed with the old stone of Buckingham Palace. This wasn't just any ordinary day for him. Today was inspection day, and he took these visits very seriously. Colonel Harrison had been doing this job for over 30 years. He'd seen young soldiers come and go, watched them grow from nervous recruits into proud guardsmen. But he never got tired of seeing the famous red uniforms and tall black hats that made the Queen's Guard so special. These weren't just any soldiers. They were the best of the best, chosen to protect the royal family. As he walked across the courtyard, his boots made a steady clicking sound on the old stones. Each step echoed off the palace walls that had stood for hundreds of years. The colonel liked this sound. It reminded him of all the soldiers who had walked these same paths before him, doing the same important job. The palace grounds were quiet this early in the morning. Most tourists wouldn't arrive for another few hours. This was the time when the real work happened, when the guards changed shifts and prepared for another day of protecting one of the most important buildings in England. The colonel preferred it this way. He could focus on what really mattered without crowds of people taking pictures and asking questions. He straightened his uniform jacket as he walked. Everything had to be perfect when you worked at the palace. Every button had to shine, every crease had to be sharp, and every movement had to show respect for the crown. The colonel had learned this lesson many years ago as a young officer, and he never forgot it. The morning mist was still hanging around the palace gardens. It gave everything a mysterious look, like something from an old movie. The colonel had seen this sight hundreds of times, but it still made him feel proud to be here. Not many people got to walk through these gates every day as part of their job. As he got closer to the guard post, he could see a figure standing perfectly still. Even from a distance, the colonel could tell this was a well-trained soldier. The guardsman's posture was straight, his rifle held at exactly the right angle, and his famous red uniform looked spotless. The big black bearskin hat sat perfectly on his head, making him look taller and more impressive. The colonel slowed his pace a little. He liked to observe the guards before they knew he was watching. This told him a lot about their character. Were they just putting on a show when they knew an officer was coming, or did they always maintain these high standards? The best guardsmen were the ones who acted the same whether anyone was watching or not. This particular guardsman caught his attention. There was something different about him, though the colonel couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. The young man stood with a kind of dignity that went beyond just following orders. It was like he truly understood the importance of his role, not just the rules he had to follow. The guardsman was quite young, probably in his early 20s. His face was serious but calm under the shadow of his bearskin hat. The colonel had seen many young soldiers over the years, and he'd learned to spot the ones who would succeed and the ones who might struggle. This one definitely looked like he belonged here. What the colonel didn't know was the incredible story behind this young guardsman. The soldier's name was Private Mitchell, and he came from a family that had been serving the royal family for generations. His great-grandfather had stood in this exact same spot during some of the most dangerous times in British history, during World War II when bombs were falling on London. But right now, the colonel was just focused on doing his job. He had a checklist in his mind of things to observe. Was the uniform properly maintained? Were the boots polished to the right shine? Was the rifle clean and held correctly? Did the guardsmen show proper respect and discipline? These might seem like small details to some people, but the colonel knew they were what separated good soldiers from great ones. The palace had very strict rules about how the guards should behave. They couldn't talk to tourists, couldn't move from their positions except in specific circumstances, and had to maintain their composure no matter what happened around them. The colonel had seen guards stay perfectly still while tourists tried to make them laugh during sudden rainstorms. And even when protesters were shouting nearby. As he got closer, the colonel began his mental evaluation. The guardsman's red tunic was immaculate, without a single wrinkle or stain. The gold buttons caught the morning light and sparkled like tiny mirrors. The white belt around his waist was perfectly positioned, and his black boots reflected the sky like polished glass. Everything looked exactly as it should, but there was something more than just good grooming here. The colonel could sense a kind of pride in this young man that went deeper than just following regulations. It was the kind of pride that came from truly believing in what you were doing. Not just going through the motions because you had to. The palace courtyard around them was full of history. Kings and queens had walked here for centuries. Important decisions that affected the whole world had been made in these buildings. Wars had been planned and peace treaties signed. The colonel always felt this weight of history when he came here, and he could tell that the guardsmen felt it too. The morning air was crisp and clean. It was the kind of weather that made everything seem more important, more serious. The colonel liked days like this for inspections. The clear air seemed to make everyone more focused. More aware of their responsibilities, he was now close enough to see the details of the guardsman's equipment. The rifle was held at exactly the right angle. The bayonet was properly attached, and every piece of metal had been polished until it gleamed. The bearskin hat, which could be quite heavy and uncomfortable, was positioned perfectly. This showed real discipline and attention to detail. The colonel had done thousands of these inspections over his long career. He'd seen guardsmen who were nervous, others who were overconfident, and many who were just doing their best to get through another day. But this young man seemed different. He had a kind of quiet confidence that impressed the experienced officer. What made this inspection special was about to be revealed. The colonel was preparing to give a routine command, expecting a standard response. He had no idea that he was about to witness something that would connect him to a piece of forgotten history, something that would change how he thought about tradition and family legacy in the military. The stage was set for an encounter that neither man would ever forget. The colonel, with all his experience and authority, was about to learn something new, and the young guardsman was about to honor his family in a way that would surprise everyone watching. Sometimes the most ordinary moments turn into something extraordinary, and this was about to be one of those times. Colonel Harrison stopped walking when he was just 3 feet away from the guardsman. The sound of his boots on the stone courtyard suddenly went quiet. The silence felt heavy, like the moment before something important happens. He could hear the distant sounds of London waking up, cars on the streets far beyond the palace walls, birds singing in the royal gardens, and the faint sound of other guards moving around the palace grounds. The colonel took a deep breath and looked the young guardsman up and down. This was the moment he had been building toward during his walk across the courtyard. Every inspection followed the same pattern. First, he would observe from a distance. Then he would come close and examine the details. Finally, he would test. The soldier's training and discipline, Private Mitchell could sense the colonel approaching, even though he kept his eyes fixed straight ahead as he had been trained to do. The guardsman could feel the weight of the officer's gaze examining every detail of his uniform and posture. His heart was beating a little faster, but his breathing remained steady and controlled. This was what he had prepared for during months of training. The morning light was getting stronger now, making the red fabric of the guardsman's tunic look even brighter. The colonel noticed how the young man's chest rose and fell in a calm, measured rhythm. This was a good sign. Many soldiers got nervous during inspections, and their breathing would become quick and shallow. But this guardsman seemed completely at ease, as if he belonged exactly where he was. Colonel Harrison had developed his own system for these inspections over the years. He would start at the top and work his way down, like reading a book from the first page to the last. The bearskin hat was positioned perfectly, sitting at exactly the right angle on the guardsman's head. The chin strap was properly adjusted, not too tight and not too loose. The heavy hat, which weighed several pounds, didn't seem to bother the young soldier at all. Moving his eyes downward, the colonel examined the red tunic. Every button was in its proper place, polished until it gleamed like gold. The white crossbelt that went across the guardsman's chest was spotless and perfectly positioned. The gold decorations on the uniform were bright and clean, showing that the soldier took real pride in his appearance. The rifle was held at exactly the right angle, with the bayonet pointing toward the sky at the precise degree required by military. Regulations. The weapon itself was immaculate. The colonel could see his own reflection in the polished metal parts. The wooden stock had been cared for with oil and attention, giving it a rich, warm color that spoke of proper maintenance. But it wasn't just the perfect uniform and equipment that impressed the colonel. There was something in the way this young guardsman carried himself that suggested he understood the deeper meaning of his role. Many soldiers could follow the rules and look good in their uniforms. But the really special ones, the ones who became legends in the military, were those who felt the weight of history and tradition in their bones. The colonel decided it was time to begin the active part of his inspection. He cleared his throat, a sound that echoed slightly off the nearby palace walls. This was the signal that the formal testing was about to begin. In his years of experience, this was often when he could separate the truly exceptional soldiers from those who were simply adequate. "Guardsman," the colonel said in his most official voice. The word hung in the air between them like a challenge. His tone was firm but not harsh, carrying all the authority of his rank and experience. He had spoken this same word to hundreds of soldiers over the years, and each time it meant the same thing. "Show me what you're made of." Private Mitchell heard the command and felt something stir inside him. This wasn't just nervousness or excitement. It was something deeper, like a connection to all the guardsmen who had stood in the same spot before him. He could almost feel the presence of his great-grandfather, who had told him stories about serving here during the war. When the palace was in real danger and every guard had to be ready to fight, the colonel continued with his command, his voice carrying across the courtyard with crisp authority. "Present arms and render a proper salute to a senior officer." These were words he had spoken countless times before. It was a standard request, one that every properly trained guardsman should be able to execute without thinking. He expected to see the familiar movements he had witnessed thousands of times throughout his career. What Colonel Harrison was expecting was simple and straightforward. A guardsman should bring his rifle up to the present arms position, hold it steady for a moment, then lower it back to his side while executing a crisp military salute with his free hand. It was a basic drill that every soldier learned in their first weeks of training. Nothing fancy, nothing complicated, just clean military precision. But as soon as the words left the colonel's mouth, he noticed something different in the guardsman's posture. There was a subtle shift, like a musician preparing to play a piece. He knew by heart. The young soldier's stance changed almost imperceptibly, becoming even more formal and ceremonial than it had been before. Private Mitchell heard the command and felt a surge of pride run through his entire body. This was his moment. Not just to follow orders, but to honor his family and show respect for the incredible legacy that had been passed down to him. His great-grandfather had taught these movements to his grandfather during family gatherings. When he was just a boy, his grandfather had shown them to his father, and his father had spent hours in their backyard, patiently teaching them to him. The guardsmen began to move, but not in the way the colonel expected. Instead of the standard military response, Private Mitchell started performing something that looked like a carefully choreographed dance. His movements were fluid yet precise, each one flowing naturally into the next. The rifle became not just a weapon, but part of an elaborate presentation that told a story without words. Colonel Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly as he watched. His first thought was confusion. This wasn't what he had asked for. His second thought was concern. Was this young guardsman showing off, or worse, being deliberately insubordinate? But as he continued to watch, a third thought began to form. Whatever this was, it was clearly not random. Every movement was deliberate and practiced, performed with a level of skill that could only come from years of training. The other palace staff, who happened to be nearby, began to slow down and watch. There was something magnetic about what they were seeing, even though none of them could identify exactly what it was. The guardsmen's movements had a kind of ancient dignity to them, like watching a tradition that came from a different time, when ceremonies meant something deeper and more personal than just following regulations. The colonel found himself holding his breath, no longer thinking about his inspection checklist. Something remarkable was happening in front of him. and he had the feeling that he was about to witness something that would change his understanding of what it meant to serve the crown. The morning sun seemed to shine brighter on the guardsman's uniform as he continued his mysterious and beautiful display of military precision and family pride. As Private Mitchell completed his elaborate ceremonial movements, the entire courtyard seemed to fall into complete silence. Even the birds in the palace gardens had stopped singing, as if nature itself was paying attention to what had just happened. The guardsman's rifle was now held in a position that Colonel Harrison had never seen before, yet somehow it looked absolutely perfect and proper. The young soldier took a breath, and then did something that surprised the colonel even more than his unusual salute. He spoke. Guards at Buckingham Palace almost never spoke during their duties, especially not to officers during formal inspections. But when Private Mitchell opened his mouth, his voice was clear, respectful, and filled with a kind of quiet pride that made everyone listening lean in closer. "Sir," the guardsman said, his voice carrying across the courtyard with perfect military precision, "I present the royal salute of the King's personal guard, as performed by Private William Mitchell, my great-grandfather in service to His Majesty, King George VI during the London Blitz of 1941. The words hit Colonel Harrison like a wave of cold water. His stern expression, which had been carefully maintained throughout his career, began to soften around the edges. His mind was racing, trying to process what he had just heard. The London Blitz was one of the darkest periods in British history, when German bombs fell on the city night after night for months. The royal family had stayed in London during those terrible times, and their guards had faced real danger every single day. The colonel had studied military history his entire life. He knew about the brave men and women who had served during World War II, but he had never imagined he would meet someone whose family had been part of those legendary stories. This wasn't just any guardsman standing in front of him. This was the great-grandson of a man who had risked his life to protect the royal family. When Britain's survival was in doubt, Private Mitchell could see the change in the colonel's face, but he wasn't finished with his explanation. He had been waiting for this moment, hoping that someday he would have the chance to honor his great-grandfather's memory in the place where the old man had served with such distinction. His family had kept this tradition alive for over 80 years, passing it down through generations like a precious treasure. My great-grandfather taught this salute to my grandfather, who taught it to my father, who taught it to me, the guardsman continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion. It has been passed down through 4 generations of my family, all of whom have served the crown with honor and dedication. The colonel felt something he hadn't experienced in years of military service. His throat was getting tight, and he had to work to keep his professional composure. He was a tough, experienced officer who had seen action in several conflicts around the world. He had given orders that sent men into dangerous situations, and he had delivered news of casualties to families. But standing here in this historic courtyard, listening to this young man speak about his family's legacy, he felt deeply moved. Around them, other palace staff had begun to gather at a respectful distance. Word was spreading quietly through the palace that something unusual was happening at the guard post. A few other guardsmen, who were off duty and heading to their quarters, had stopped and turned to watch. Palace workers, who were normally rushing to complete their morning tasks, had slowed down and were trying to get a better view without being obvious about it. The story that Private Mitchell was telling wasn't just about one family. It was about the kind of dedication and loyalty that had kept Britain strong through its darkest hours. During the London Blitz, many people had fled the city to escape the bombing, but the royal family had stayed, and their guards had stayed with them. Every night, when the air raid sirens wailed and the bombs began to fall, these brave men had stood at their posts, ready to defend the palace with their lives. Colonel Harrison was beginning to understand that what he had witnessed wasn't just an elaborate military drill. It was a living piece of history, a bridge connecting the present moment to one of the most heroic periods in British military service. The elaborate movements, the precise rifle work, the ceremonial footwork, all of it had been created during a time when ceremony and tradition had to be maintained even while bombs were falling from the sky. "Young man," the colonel said, and his voice was different now. The harsh authority was gone, replaced by something warmer and more respectful. "Do you realize what you've just performed?" The question hung in the air, and everyone who was watching could sense that this was more than just a conversation between an officer and a guardsman. This was a moment when past and present were coming together in a way that rarely happened. Private Mitchell nodded respectfully, but his eyes were bright with the knowledge that his great-grandfather's story was finally being heard in the place where it belonged. "Yes, sir. My great-grandfather was one of only 12 guardsmen selected to learn this special salute during the war. It was used exclusively when greeting members of the royal family during air raids, when formal ceremony had to be maintained even in the most dire circumstances." The colonel's mind was working quickly now, fitting pieces of military history together like a puzzle. He remembered reading about the special protocols that had been developed during the war, the ways that tradition and ceremony had been adapted to fit the dangerous reality of a nation under attack. But he had never imagined that any of those protocols had survived into the present day. The 12 guardsmen that Private Mitchell mentioned would have been the elite of the elite, chosen not just for their military skills but for their ability to maintain perfect composure under the most extreme pressure imaginable. They would have been men who could perform their ceremonial duties while bombs exploded nearby, who could maintain the dignity of the crown even when their own lives were in constant danger. As the colonel listened, he began to understand that the young guardsman in front of him represented something incredibly rare in the modern military. Most traditions were preserved in books and museums, studied by historians and taught in military academies. But this tradition had been kept alive in the most personal way possible, passed down from father to son, practiced in family backyards and living rooms, maintained by people who believed that some things were too important to let disappear. The morning sun was getting stronger now, and it seemed to make the whole scene more vivid and important. The red of the guardsman's uniform looked brighter. The gold decorations seemed to shine with more intensity, and even the old stones of the palace courtyard seemed to reflect the light in a way that made everything feel more alive and meaningful. "Colonel." Harrison realized that his routine inspection had turned into something completely unexpected. He had come here to check on military standards and discipline, but instead he had stumbled upon a treasure of family history and military tradition that was more valuable than anything he could have imagined. This young guardsman had just given him a gift, the chance to witness history coming alive in the present moment. Colonel Harrison stood there for a long moment, letting the weight of what he had just learned sink in. The busy sounds of London seemed far away now, as if the palace walls had created a bubble around this extraordinary moment. He could feel his heart beating faster, not from excitement but from a deep sense of respect for what he had witnessed. In all his years of military service, through wars and peacetime, through countless inspections and ceremonies, he had never experienced anything quite like this. The colonel's military mind was working overtime, trying to process the historical significance of what had just happened. He knew the stories of World War II, had studied the battles and the strategies, had read about the brave men and women who had fought for Britain's survival. But those had always been stories in books, names on monuments, black and white photographs, in museums. Now he was standing face to face with a living connection to those heroic times. "Young man," Colonel Harrison said, and his voice carried a new tone of deep respect, "do you realize what you've just performed?" The question wasn't really asking if Private Mitchell understood the movements he had made. It was asking if he understood the profound historical moment they were sharing together in this ancient courtyard. Private Mitchell's eyes met the colonel's for just a moment before returning to their proper forward position. "Yes, sir. My great-grandfather was one of only 12 guardsmen selected to learn this special salute during the war. It was used exclusively when greeting members of the royal family during air raids, when formal ceremony had to be maintained even in the most dire circumstances." The colonel felt a chill run down his spine. Air raids. He tried to imagine what it must have been like to stand guard at this palace while bombs were falling from the sky, while the city around them was burning, while nobody knew if Britain would survive as a free nation. The courage it must have, taken to maintain perfect military bearing while death could come from above at any moment, was almost beyond comprehension. "Could you?" the colonel asked, his voice softer now. "Could you show me the complete sequence again? I want to understand every part of what your great-grandfather taught your family." It wasn't really a command anymore. It was a request from one military man to another, a plea to witness something that might never be seen again. Private Mitchell nodded with quiet dignity. "It would be my honor, sir." He reset his position, taking the same stance he had learned as a child in his family's backyard, the same stance his great-grandfather had taken in this very spot when King George VI needed protection during the darkest days of the war. What happened next was like watching a master craftsman at work. Every movement Private Mitchell made was deliberate and precise, but more than that, it was meaningful. The colonel watched as the rifle work began, and he could see that each position the weapon took had a purpose, a story to tell. The way the bayonet pointed toward the sky wasn't just ceremonial flourish. It represented the guardian's readiness to defend against any threat. Even those coming from above, the footwork was equally impressive. Private Mitchell's boots moved in a pattern that was both complex and beautiful, creating a rhythm that seemed to echo off the palace walls. The colonel realized that this wasn't just military drill, it was like watching a dance that had been choreographed by history itself. Each step the guardsman took was a step that his great-grandfather had taken, a step that connected the present moment to the past in the most personal way possible. As the sequence continued, the colonel began to understand the symbolism behind each movement. The way Private Mitchell held his left hand wasn't random. It was positioned over his heart, representing the oath of loyalty that every guardsman took when they swore to protect the crown. The way he turned his head at certain moments wasn't just part of the choreography. It was a visual representation of the guards' duty to watch for danger from every direction. The rifle movements were particularly fascinating to watch. The weapon moved through positions that the colonel had never seen in any military manual, yet each one looked absolutely correct and proper. At one point, Private Mitchell held the rifle horizontally above his head, and the colonel realized this must represent the guardsman's willingness to lay down his life if necessary. At another point, the rifle was held diagonally across his chest, creating a visual barrier between himself and any threat to the royal family. The most moving part of the sequence came near the end, when Private Mitchell performed what could only be described as a pledge of service. The guardsman placed his right hand over his heart, while his left hand gripped the rifle, and he bowed his head for just a moment in what was clearly a gesture of solemn commitment. The colonel understood immediately that this was the moment. When the guardsman pledged himself unto death in service of the crown, the final hand gesture was simple but powerful. Private Mitchell raised his right hand in a salute that was different from the standard military salute the colonel knew. This one was slower, more deliberate, held for a longer time. It was a salute that said more than just, "I acknowledge your authority." It was a salute that said, "I carry the honor of my family, the memory of my ancestors, and the weight of history in my service." When the sequence was complete, the courtyard fell silent again. The small crowd that had gathered to watch remained perfectly still, as if they instinctively understood that they had witnessed something sacred. Even the palace cats, who usually wandered freely through the grounds, had stopped their morning activities and were sitting quietly nearby, as if they too sensed the importance of the moment. Colonel Harrison felt tears forming in his eyes, though his military training kept them from falling. He had seen many impressive displays of military skill and discipline throughout his career, but nothing had ever moved him like this. This wasn't just about perfect execution of movements or adherence to regulations. This was about love of family, love of country, love of tradition, and love of duty that transcended any individual person. The colonel began to understand that what he had witnessed wasn't just a family tradition. It was a piece of living history that had somehow survived when so many other traditions had been lost. In a world where things changed rapidly and people often forgot the sacrifices of previous generations, this family had kept something precious. Alive through their dedication and care, other guards and palace staff were still gathering at a respectful distance, drawn by word that something remarkable was happening at the guard post. The colonel could see maintenance workers who had stopped their duties, kitchen staff who had stepped outside for a moment, and even some of the palace administrators who had heard about the unusual ceremony taking place in the courtyard. What struck the colonel most was the realization that Private Mitchell's great-grandfather had performed this same salute in this same place when the survival of the entire British Empire was in doubt. The old guardsman had stood here when London was burning, when no one knew if they would survive the next night's bombing, when every day might have been the last day of freedom for the British people. And now, more than 80 years later, his great-grandson was performing the same movements, honoring the same traditions, serving the same crown in the same place. It was a testament to the power of family, the strength of tradition, and the enduring nature of duty and honor that could survive even the darkest times in human history. Colonel Harrison took a deep breath and did something he had never done in his 30 years of military service. He stepped back, straightened his shoulders, and came to full attention. The experienced officer, who had commanded thousands of soldiers and received salutes from men and women around the world, was about to return a salute to a young guardsman in a way that would honor not just the soldier in front of him, but the entire legacy he represented. The colonel raised his hand slowly and deliberately, performing the ceremonial salute exactly as Private Mitchell had shown him. It wasn't perfect. He hadn't spent years learning the precise movements, but every gesture was filled with respect and recognition. As he held the salute, he felt the weight of history flowing through his arm, connecting him to the brave guardsmen of World War II and to the unbroken chain of service that linked past and present. "Private Mitchell," the colonel said, his voice now carrying the full authority of his rank, but tempered with genuine warmth and respect. "You have just demonstrated something I thought was lost to history forever. Your family's dedication to preserving this tradition honors not only the crown, but every guardsman who has ever stood watch at these gates." The words echoed across the courtyard, and everyone who heard them understood that they were witnessing something truly special. This wasn't just an officer praising a soldier for good performance. This was a recognition of something much deeper, the power of family legacy, the importance of remembering those who came before, and the way that true traditions can survive even when the world changes around them. Private Mitchell's eyes remained fixed straight ahead, but the colonel could see the emotion playing across his face. The young guardsman had carried this family secret for years, practicing the movements in private, wondering if he would ever have the chance to perform them in the place where they belonged. Now, not only had he honored his great-grandfather's memory, but he had received recognition from a senior officer who understood the historical significance of what had been preserved. The colonel's mind was already racing ahead, thinking about what needed to happen next. This wasn't something that could be kept quiet or forgotten. The military history community needed to know about this discovery. The palace historians needed to document every detail of the ceremonial salute before any part of it was lost. And, most importantly, other members of the Queen's Guard needed to learn about this piece of their heritage. "I need to make some phone calls," the colonel said, pulling out his mobile phone. The first call was to the captain of the Queen's Guard, a man who had served at the palace for over 20 years and who would immediately understand the importance of what had been discovered. The phone rang twice before a crisp voice answered. "Captain, this is Colonel Harrison. I'm at the palace, and I need you to come to the main courtyard immediately. We've discovered something extraordinary, a piece of our military heritage that we thought was lost forever." The colonel's voice carried an excitement that the captain had never heard from the usually reserved officer. Within 10 minutes, the captain of the Queen's Guard arrived, along with 2 other senior officers who had been in the palace that morning. Word was spreading quickly through the military hierarchy that something significant was happening. The small crowd that had been gathering throughout the morning had grown larger, but everyone maintained a respectful distance, Understanding instinctively that they were witnessing history in the making, the colonel quickly explained what had happened, describing the ceremonial salute and its connection to the London Blitz as he spoke. He could see the amazement growing on the faces of the other officers. These were men who had dedicated their lives to military service and who understood the rarity of what had been preserved in the Mitchell family. "Could you perform the salute once more?" the captain asked Private Mitchell. "I want to make sure we capture every detail correctly." The guardsman nodded and reset his position, preparing to honor his great-grandfather's memory once again. This time, as Private Mitchell performed the ceremonial sequence, the senior officers watched with the trained eyes of military historians. They observed the precise angles of the rifle movements, the timing of the footwork, the symbolism of each gesture. One of the officers took notes on his phone, while another recorded a video to ensure that nothing would be lost. When the demonstration was complete, the captain of the Queen's Guard made a decision that would change Private Mitchell's life forever. "Private Mitchell," he said formally, "you are hereby commended for maintaining your family's legacy and for bringing this invaluable piece of military history back to light. Furthermore, I am arranging for you to meet with our military historians this afternoon to document every aspect of this ceremonial salute." But the captain wasn't finished. "Additionally," he continued, "I want you to begin training a select group of guardsmen in this ceremonial salute. We will incorporate it into special royal occasions, ensuring that your great-grandfather's legacy becomes part of our official traditions once again." The impact of these words hit everyone in the courtyard like a thunderbolt. Private Mitchell's family tradition, kept alive through 4 generations of private dedication, was about to become an official part of the Queen's Guard ceremonies. The movements that his great-grandfather had performed during the darkest days of World War II would now be performed again during the brightest moments of royal celebration. Colonel Harrison watched the young guardsman's face and saw something beautiful happening. The weight of carrying this family secret alone was being lifted from Private Mitchell's shoulders. No longer would he be the only one responsible for keeping his great-grandfather's memory alive. The entire Queen's Guard would now share that responsibility. Ensuring that the tradition would survive for generations to come, the palace historian arrived within the hour, carrying cameras and recording equipment to document every detail of the ceremonial salute. Private Mitchell spent the afternoon teaching the movements to the historian and to several senior guardsmen, breaking down each gesture and explaining the symbolism that his family had preserved along with the physical movements. As the day progressed, word spread beyond the palace walls. Military historians from across Britain began calling to ask about the discovery. Newspapers started preparing articles about the family who had kept a piece of World War II history alive through their private dedication. Television crews requested permission to film interviews with Private Mitchell and his family, but perhaps the most meaningful recognition came later that evening, when Private Mitchell received a personal message from a member of the royal family, thanking him for preserving this piece of their family's history. The message noted that King George VI, who had been protected by Private Mitchell's great-grandfather during the London Blitz, would have been proud to know that his guardsman's legacy had survived and flourished. Colonel Harrison returned to his office that evening with a completely different perspective on military tradition and family legacy. What had started as a routine inspection had become a reminder of why military service was about more than just following orders and maintaining discipline. It was about connecting with something larger than oneself, about being part of a story. That began long before you were born and would continue long after you were gone. The discovery of the ceremonial salute had an impact that reached far beyond Buckingham Palace. Military families across Britain began sharing their own stories of traditions that had been passed down through generations. Veterans came forward with forgotten ceremonies and customs that their families had preserved. The idea that ordinary families could be the guardians of extraordinary history inspired people to look more carefully at their own family legacies. Private Mitchell's story became a symbol of how the most important traditions are often kept alive, not by institutions or governments, but by families who understand that some things are too precious to let disappear. His great-grandfather's courage during the London Blitz had been honored not just by medals or official recognition, but by the loving care of 4 generations who made sure his memory would never fade.